Hey, today we're going to talk about streaming on Facebook. Some basics, go through some steps that I've learned over the years in webcast productions. I'd like to share that with you. So we're going to jump right into it. Let's go. Hello, fellow streamers, webcast producers, those that are new to the live streaming community, those that have been doing it for a while, welcome to the channel. Glad to have you with me today. So the little story about this hat is I purchased that off of livestreamingpros.com. They're great folks that are working on doing education and helping people that are individual live streamers, as well as they have some great little t-shirts, hats, and variety of different items that you can purchase. And so if you'd like to go check them out, go to livestreamingpros.com. Highly recommend them. So today we're going to talk about Facebook. And the concept of this approach that I'm taking is more of a streaming university kind of 101 approach. So I'm not going to be able to go into everything in regards to Facebook, but what I do want to cover is the basics and some thoughts, considerations when it comes to approaches from a production, some facts about Facebook and how they handle their streaming, both at an individual live producer creator studio, as well as in regards to the broadcasting level, and some do's and don'ts, as well as jump into the interface of live producer through Creator Studio, and we'll go through that. So there'll be some follow-on. I'd love to have your feedback and comments about this. Is it helpful? Does it kind of give you some thoughts and considerations into when it comes to understanding? Because I think I know that I've seen comments when it comes to Facebook through Facebook communities and others of how to do things in a certain way, understanding how Facebook works when it comes to what I'm specifically referring to is the live streaming aspect of it. And then understanding kind of the little nuances, if you will, the quirks and features of the product, of how you manage it, right? And a lot of times I see some comments that are common and repeated comments. So I kind of want to go into a surface level. So think of this as a part one. If this is helpful, then hit the like button. That lets me know that this was helpful. Ring the bell to let me know, get notified that you got notified that when I upload a video, as well as subscribe, right? And so we want to make sure that you're part of the community that I'm trying to build here and share with you as we collaborate with others in the live streaming community. That's what this channel is all about, is connecting, streaming, and delivering. Okay, so let's jump into the presentation. So when we talk about an agenda, if you will, where we're going, we want to focus on the basics. And I look at that as kind of the production basics, not so much Facebook specifically, but what I'm referring to, just some basic thoughts in terms of production, Facebook streaming, talk about the framework, and then kind of dive into for a moment in the things to do and not to do. Now, there are some other type of elements in Facebook that we'll go into at a later date, but in general, this is kind of where we'll go. So it begins with the basics. And I don't want to dive too much into this, but what I really want to refer to is the focus around your production. When we think about a production of a live stream, even if you're an individual streamer or you're maybe handling a need for a client, maybe it's a church, maybe you're a nonprofit doing a large gala event, right? Or gala event, and you're trying to develop and facilitate a process by which you will run the production. So one of the lessons that I've learned over the past 6 to 7+ years that I've been doing live streaming and production from a producer, webcast producer, into the technical side of things is really about the format, right? If you think about it, it's the format that really drives kind of the focus, if you will, of how you're going to deliver. And when I talk about those formats, I specifically dive into a pre, main, and post. If you think about a TV event or show, sporting event, those type of activities, those are areas where you want to focus on what is the pre-event, pre-show, screens, those type of elements, background music, things you're running there. The main event obviously is the main show or the specific task that you're driving in terms of the primary event. And then at the same time, you want to look at the post, and that sometimes we'll use the term outro, and what we're referring to is the exit out of the program, right? We transition from the main primary program out to the outbound side of it. And that could be another screen and music, background music, and saying thank you for watching. I think this is kind of a good approach to think about when you put something together. And some of you already are probably doing this and familiar with this process. For those that you don't, I think probably the biggest issue that I've seen with Facebook is where people just want to quickly start an event and do it and go live. That really doesn't work very well with Facebook. And I would say from this perspective is thinking about it as a scheduled event. You want to schedule, it's event-based driven. So therefore, whatever content you're going to drive, either live or simulated live, you kind of want to work through that process. So format is one. Prepping, again, I just mentioned scheduling. If you have 5 days in advance, you can schedule. Go for that, right? As much time as you can prepare and plan your event, that is what you really need to think about. And that's true for any of us, even for me, just preparing for this and doing a dry run, I call it. And that means kind of having a practice session and thinking about the elements that I'm going to have to drive through this recording and focus on to keep it fairly tight. So that's kind of another area to think about when you look at prepping, is this really kind of planning in advance. And a good workflow really lends to, I think, success when it comes to from the perspective of the ability to ensure that the event is successful. And that, again, goes back to the planning and the preparing. And that is, we're talking about, test and validation, making sure your systems and whatever you're going to be using to stream on Facebook is set up and configured correctly. Your network. If you're bringing other elements into play, such as a remote guest, right? All of those become factors that you really need to determine the right approach. So test and validate is really key. And determine the request, right? Understanding what the request is of you to deliver on that event, right? And I would say that is true for live or simulated live, that, I treat them as both, even though I have pre-captured content that will be used for driving the event and what we call simulated live. I treat live and those areas as equal. I have to think of that format structure, scheduling, and how I'm going to use that content and drive it through either a local system or something maybe a little bit more advanced in terms of technology related when we talk about cloud architectures, right? So those are just some, I think that's key to think about in terms of your workflow. Creating a checklist and mastering your tools and being able to do that as you master those tools, being able to become kind of what I call the ninja, right? You can quickly pivot, your systems, how they work, and they work well when you've validated that process and kind of what it looks like. And that's true as we jump into this streaming option, because with Facebook, when you think about it, there's two elements you're looking at. There's the live producer going live, scheduling the event that we're talking about today, but there's the Facebook Premium, and that's more of the higher level, where I was working in more of the broadcaster level, where I had PC-like boxes. I call them encoders, or that's what in the industry we use the term hardware encoders, and decoders. We'll use the same kind of interchange those, and they have two different meanings. But from an encoding perspective, that's really what you're doing from a restream, or let's say you're taking Ecamm, you're taking OBS or a vMix, and you're driving that into a restream.io, or you're driving that direct to Facebook or that particular event. And so the software encoders is really the software you're running either on your PC or your Mac, right? If it's Mac, it's Ecamm. If it's PC, that could be OBS. That could be vMix. It could be Wirecast, right? Those are we call software-based encoders. And, if you think about Live Producer, this is kind of an area where, you think of the elements that are part of that producer sequence of that process. The other side of it on the premium is more advanced, right? And so for the producer, there's a link within Facebook if you're not familiar with it. And we'll go into that when I share the screen, talking about how do you get to Creator Studio? How do you use the live producer? And that you need to have the right management. So one of the lessons I've learned over the past several years is that obviously, just like any social media platform, you need to assign the right rights or editor rights or admin rights to that individual that's going to manage, or that you have those rights to manage Facebook pages, cross-posting, when we talk about cross-posting to other pages, and that you have to be able to have the appropriate rights and management oversight, as well as if you are the admin, maybe the owner of the pages, you need to make sure that you sign those rights to those people in your team. So, management in terms of, and that's where I refer to, and we'll put some links in the description that talk about linking to the, have I signed the right admin rights to this individual? Do I have the right admin rights as a webcast producer to be able to go live for somebody on their Facebook page? I've done plenty of those where I need to have at least editor rights. But what we found and discovered actually with Facebook is that if you can have the biz admin rights, as I call it, that gives you the ability to go in and, from a business manager level, to do more in terms of the management of when you go live on a particular page, as well as when you use the cross-posting page function within the Producer Studio product or feature. You can schedule events. We talked about that in terms of Facebook, and that's ability. It's a schedule-based system as opposed to other platforms where they operate a little bit differently. So in Facebook's case, and their particular infrastructure today, as it stands, is you have the ability to schedule the event, then discover that event, or tie to a specific ID. We'll jump into that when we go into the Creator Studio product or Live Producer, and identify what that is, and your ability to then connect. And then when you go live and you start streaming to that event, then you're able to connect to the specific ID that's associated with that. So it's event driven in the sense that you create it, you do that, and that's the way Facebook works. And obviously, as I talked about, testing and validating is key. And a lot of times when I do with Creator Studio and even with the premium level, we're going live 20 minutes out. That's actually a recommendation from Facebook, where we're not going live in the sense of live on the Facebook event itself. What we are doing is sending a live stream to Facebook 20 minutes out. That's given me a little bit of a parameter to work with when it comes to just validating that the stream is working and things like that. So that's key. So that part of that event process, and we'll get into that a little bit more here shortly, but that's just something to think about there as far as, again, that workflow really becomes important. Linking to pages for giving. So Facebook does offer an option to do that. And that's an area that Facebook has kind of provided to people to have some kind of a link to a giving page. This has become more of a reality, obviously, with the online activity that's increased because of the pandemic, where you're seeing nonprofits where traditionally they would have held a physical event for to benefit a specific need in the community, or a church, let's say, for giving. Now we're looking at options of how do we enable that when we engage with people on Facebook in a live stream, even in a simulated live stream, and can I have a link to something that would promote a giving option while they're watching? So there is an option there, and I'll kind of point that out to you as well, give you a link. So the max duration for a live stream on Facebook is 8 hours, and there are some people who have tried to do 24-hour events. The example I use is SpaceX with the Crew 1 or Demo Crew 1 mission with NASA earlier this year in 2020, where they launched an event, obviously for the mission, and they started a stream that actually ran, or the intention was to run it 24 hours, so that when they ran it and they were going through that process, they hit the 8-hour mark, and they had to create a new ID on a different platform, of course. But this is true for Facebook, right? So I understand people ask, well, what's the max stream length in terms of the time allotted you can stream live is 8 hours. On premium, the max preview is 5 hours. And what we're referring to, and I'll go in this when I share the screen, that's referring to where I go into Live Producer, I go into Creator Studio, and I have this preview of the live stream. I'm not going to the page itself, but what I am able to see is the preview. There is a max limit, my understanding from Facebook, and that is something that just to be aware of when you get more on the premium side. But even if you weren't, generally some people do that, and that just depends on the length of the event, obviously, but that's just a threshold level just to point out there is on that point. And again, on premium, it's more of the broadcast level. I talked about the hardware focused encoders, but this is where, I'm working with a video team, an audio team. Network either way is obviously important for whether you're going at a premium level or even at just a individual streamer or some type of virtual event that you're hosting and running on Facebook. Network is obviously a big deal. For the premium level and the broadcaster, it's even a bigger type of setup and configuration because we're looking at a primary and a backup of the streams. We're testing what we call pops, and that really is kind of the, not to get too technical, what we're referring to is Facebook has a tool to be able to test your ingest point. And what I mean by that is when I connect from site A, let's just say I'm at the site, to site B, to Facebook, what I'm referring to is the connection, right? And what's the optimal connection time that I need in terms of dealing with latency and other variables from a technology perspective. So obviously I'm going into some of the details here in terms of some technical specifics. And so if you're new on some of these areas, I'm going to provide some information linking to some information that will help you, or provide some information that links to some information that will help you hopefully get a better understanding of some of these specifics. So I encourage everybody to spend the time necessary to research, develop your own workflow, your own process so that you can get up to speed. Because a lot of these terms and things are somewhat foreign in their concept in terms of the technical aspect of it. And I get that. And I think that right now what we need to focus on is the education component and learning. And then as you share and ask like, hey, JP, what would be this area here? What would we need to look at? And those are maybe areas on Facebook they provide information on. A lot of this information that I'm using today is in reference to some documents that they have produced that Facebook was kind enough to provide me to look at. And that's just because of the areas that I work in terms of the broadcast level, in addition to other areas of advisory services that I provide to people that I work with on a one-to-one or one-to-many type approach. Okay, so we jump out for a moment here out of my current presentation, and I want to provide some heads up information in regards to the area of what we talk about bit rates. Now I'm going to be going into the area of talking about streaming setup, and these are the bit rates you can enter in from a premium or broadcast level. So in most of the common software programs, they use a concept we call VBR, variable bit rate, VBR. And so VBR is referring to the fact that you'll connect at a certain initial connection to like a restream from your software. That could be an eCam, again, Wirecast, vMix, and then it will vary in terms of the average. This has become somewhat problematic, I would say, for people who are doing online streaming, still learning the process and going through that. And for those of you that are new, a lot of these programs don't give you the option to enter the bit rate. It says high, medium, or low. And that's based on the program that's going to manage that kind of those algorithms behind the scene. In the streaming community that I'm, as a whole, I think we've really kind of transitioned to more of a CBR approach, consistent bit rate. And CBR just gives you the ability to be able to set the bit rate, especially with Facebook or a YouTube or another platform out there. And it allows you to kind of maybe lock in a certain bit rate, manage that. So if it's 720p, we're talking about 3.5 megabits. If you're doing 1080p, we're talking about 5 to 6 megabits. And then when you make the connection and you're managing, you're looking at monitoring analyzing the overall stream health, that gives you more consistency in terms of like, hey, this is what I'm able to connect with. And again, that comes back to you being able to test what your upload. So if you're able to upload and support 10, 15 megabits, no problem. You can go from there, right? And then that bit rate will just lock in at whatever you set it at. Consult with your software program or hardware manufacturer. Use a hardware encoder. A lot of times they'll have information about this. Talk to their support teams and just ask them, do you support a CBR option? Can I set the bit rate within the program? Some do and some don't. But the general rule now is we want to get CBR because of the process, because of the fact that we have so much online network access connections going on, and a lot of times if we're trying to analyze and triage a situation, fix a problem, basically, the CBR is an easier method. A lot of the work that I've done has been on the CBR route. There are some other networking at another time, other more sophisticated networking programs that do network analysis and will manage use a CBR method, but kind of gives you the ability to add some better management, let me put it that way, when it comes to the overall stream health and quality and connection speed. Another conversation, another time. So let's jump back into the presentation. Again, let me know if you have any questions about this, feedback. Thanks. I go into a lot of detail on this, but what I will say on this specifically is referring to how you would configure an encoder. There are some software encoders, like I believe in OBS and some of the other ones out there, that you may be able to adjust your bit rate and look at the accepted frame rate, kind of how you're constructing your stream and how you're going to send that to them. 60 frames per second is what you typically see with sports and esports and gaming events. And that's just because you have a lot of fast-moving objects in the framing from a video perspective. And so that requires a different, faster refresh and the ability to handle that sequence of frames that are being built out during a live stream type approach. Typically with live streams, we're doing 30 frames per second. That's usually the standard that we go with. There's some people that try to use 24 frames per second, which is supported. However, I would state this: 24 frames per second and that level, you're talking about cinematic, and that's more of a capture, not recommended from a live stream. And so the standard is 30 frames per second. The resolution that Facebook supports is 720p. That's the max resolution, 1280 by 720. There is a caveat to this, and there is support for a higher level quality of 1080p. However, I would stipulate and set the side note as this: if you have a Facebook relationship, let's say through the advertising group or some part of their organization, they have what they call Facebook partner managers. And those individuals would be able to provide a way to request to allow you to stream at a higher quality level, in this case 1080p. Now, the next question somebody's going to ask, like in general for a broader audience watching this, they're going to say, how do we get that? I do not have the answer to that question. And that's just because Facebook does not provide that information. The only information they provided me is that they said you need a partner manager. So there's no formal form online that you can go and say, okay, I want to do 1080p over 720 because we need a higher quality. This is an area that you have to have some kind of ongoing relationship with Facebook or that you're developing. What I encourage you to do is this, though, is reach out to them, ask them, like say, hey, we don't have a formal relationship. Would this be possible? And if I get information from Facebook to provide back to you, I'm happy to do that as I talk to them to see how, if there's a different process, you could request it formally. But today, there is no formal request process other than unless you have an advertising manager or somebody through their business groups that you're working with, that you can inquire with them initially. And that's what I would encourage everybody to do. If you do that, then see what happens and see if they can get you at that level. Again, that does mean it goes back to that test and validation. You've got to make sure it all works, right? And that's key. The rest of this is more about specifics about supporting different video at a broadcast premium level. 1080i is a standard by which a lot of video production teams use for their own internal production versus progressive, what we call 1080p. And that just means these are very specific areas of parameters that are from Facebook that you need to make sure that you have implemented for your progressive format, and understand that 1080i is not supported. Somebody will say, okay, well, if we are doing broadcast and we do have a video team that uses 1080i, how would I make that convergence from, hop from one area over to another? That's really where your software encoder comes into play, or your hardware encoder, because those are going to provide you an area where you can configure this to send a 1080p stream, not to get in a lot of the P's and the I's and all that stuff that I'm mentioning here. But what I'm referring to is that the encoders themselves are the ones that are providing the conversion, the ability to send that stream. if you're an individual streamer and you're going like, this is really losing me, I'm really lost, I understand. This is at a higher level, but it's information I wanted to provide in this session initially to talk about that, because I've seen some questions come up, especially for churches and other institutions, or let's say a corporate event where people are having some issues with Facebook, just from a technical interface at a premium level. So you can go back and roll through this. Things to do and not to do with Facebook Live. Again, this is another question I saw come up in some forums where people said, we were streaming and Facebook blocked us, right? And what I found out in talking with folks is generally this refers or relates to the fact that they were streaming music. Could have been an audio track before the event started. It could have been some graphics. It could have been some other copyrighted material. The general rule of thumb is you want to use royalty-free music, graphics, and make sure you have permissions to use if you have a movie or some kind of other media content, that you have proper permissions to do that. If you don't, then don't do it. And so the question of people come back and say, well, what would I go use? Well, there are things like Epidemic Music, Soundstripe, just to name a couple. If you're a church, there's CCLI and what we call CCS, Christian Copyright Services, which you would need to have in place already if you're live streaming from a broadcast perspective, or using your own music that's royalty-free, not copyrighted, not owned by anybody. So in general, if you're using any type of material up front, just spend the time and effort to make sure that you use something that's royalty-free. Use one of the services that you can associate your Facebook account with, or a client that maybe is part of, that would be tied with an Epidemic or a Soundstripe, or you provide that service. If you're a church, it's maybe the worship team, right? Or some type of other instrumental piece that's not copyright. That's my recommendation. That's a best practice that I've dealt with, and going through some classes myself on that. That's been a very big challenge for a lot of people that I've had to learn over the past several years when I've done large events, and we had movies and we had things in a stadium we were running, and we had to make sure and cut away because we didn't have proper copyrights to be able to utilize that. Okay, so we've talked about some thoughts there. Let's take a look and go into the Live Producer product, right? And what does that look like? And go spend a few minutes talking about that process. So I'm going into my Facebook page, and I am going into the Manage My Page section, and there is a element here, and I'm going to take my mouse, and you'll see me turn my head here just for a moment. So there's an option here called Publishing Tools. And when you go to Publishing Tools, you'll see as it comes up another set of information there to take a look at and select from. You want to select Creator Studio. And then you come to the Creator Studio framework. Now, there's a lot of different elements in here that we'll cover another time, but you're going to want to go to the Go Live option. When you go to the Go Live option, you're going to come into the actual Live Producer product. Now, let me stipulate one kind of item here as a side note on this, is that I would be using this too for the premium level. This is kind of both. It's kind of a combined function. So even though I talk about premium, it's not like there's a separate screen that you're going into, right? What you're really tying into is the Live Producer product. So it actually kind of associates with both at an initial level for handling both the individual and the live stream. Now, I'm recording and I can't, do a subsequent set up a live stream and actually go live, and we're not going to do that in this session. We'll do that at another future date and kind of show how would that work through a restream, those type of elements if I was using an eCam or another type of software encoder, maybe it's a hardware encoder. So, but in today's walkthrough, we're going to talk about Live Producer and just go over some of the basics. And some of this is going to seem familiar to a lot of you. And if it is, I apologize, because I don't think, it's meant to be a repeat. I think there is information what I'm going to share as best practices, and this may be useful for those of you that have been doing this for a while, just for thought and consideration, right? So in here, you'll put your title, obviously the description, And this is where, when I talk about cross-posting to more pages, this is where you're going to have the ability to go in here and actually cross-post to other pages. And when you see those other pages, those are pages that I have rights to be able to cross-post to. So obviously, if I was at a church or another organization or working and supporting an event, I usually will ask somebody, like, make sure I have appropriate rights to cross-post to your page, so that, you know, when I go in to schedule the event and do that, I want to make sure I have the proper, I talked about that earlier, the admin rights, right? That's key and critical to what we're doing. And that's cross-posting pages. The audience settings is an area where we talk about geo-specific, or we call it geo-fencing, or, you know, I might use the term that way loosely, but geo-blocking areas. And what we're referring to is managing, is this for everybody in terms of the general public? Is there a certain age group this content's attributed to? Are there to allow it in selected locations, right? If I do that, this might be country specific. You know, this is allowed in one country, and this kind of gets into the restricted selected locations. That's kind of the way I would look at it. Is there are some events that I've run where, you know, we can only do it in the United States, right? Or let's say United States and Canada, maybe parts of Europe. So this comes down to content that, you know, there may be some copyright, there may be some other elements that are tied to that require, again, that comes back to that request process and review. I talked about the workflow of going back to that and ensuring that you understand what the requirements and the ask is of you to deliver on that. So that's on the audience settings. Obviously, gaming, there's not a lot of gaming. However, I would again, this is an area that some people are doing gaming events. I don't see a lot of it particularly on Facebook. Not to say it's not being done, but this is just something, you know, some people, and in fact, Microsoft canceled their mixed streaming environment, and that was an area they were supporting with gamers, and that has now translated over to Facebook. And in doing that, and so that's another topic for another time, but that's kind of like, you know, we can skip past that one. Now, there is a cool option that Facebook offers, and that's called Publish as a Test Broadcast. And they actually do recommend this, and I recommend it. If you wanted to do a test broadcast, you could select this, okay? And then if I select it, and it comes back here in a moment, we'll give it a moment. Let's take a look here. So if I selected it one more time, then there's an area where I could do a test broadcast. This, in a sense, is not working the way I want it to, but if you were doing a test broadcast, what this refers to is you can test it and then view it only as an admin. And that doesn't mean when you do the test broadcast that everybody can see it. This kind of gives you an idea that if you were doing a broadcast and you wanted to validate that, I recommend using that a lot, just to ensure that you know everything is working from a live event, especially if it's simulated live and you're playing content back. That would be an option there that you need to make sure and cover. So that's an option actually Facebook recommends. So again, these are for admins. So when you test that broadcast, only you as the admin will be able to see that event. Nobody else on the Facebook page themselves would be able to see it. So it's a useful option. There is a new option too for creating a new event. This refers to tickets and events. Facebook recently announced this year in 2020 that you can set up another area where somebody would be what we call a paywall type service, where you pay and let's say $5 and you can watch that live event. That's a new option. I'll provide a link again in the description that talks about that, so you can take more look at it. That's an event you were running and let's say it's a paid event. And that would be giving into a new option. There's a set of services that Facebook is now providing to the creator community as a whole. And let's get into the getting started function. This is where, in this case, we're going to be looking at the setup and going from there. So there, in general, this is where you can cross post, you can share, and to do more with pages that can watch. Again, Facebook changes this from time to time. My recommendation for a lot of folks is to make sure that you go and spend the time necessary to go through this, and because they will add features in the live producer or area of this page, and sometimes you'll see a new option that wasn't there before, right? So you might see something where you can add graphics to your video. And what they're doing is they're now allowing you to add graphics. If I go up here, and I'll mention this just real quick, there is a graphics option here where you can upload and select a graphics package. So you could add graphics to your live video through Live Producer and go through that area, as well as they give you stream health information, so you can see how your stream is running and performing. You can do polls, questions during the live stream or simulated live stream. I mentioned that featured link. You could do a featured link that may link to your giving page. That's an option. And of course, they have the help option. Now, I'm running through a lot of things in here, but we'll cover that in more detail hopefully another time. Maybe we might have more of a Q&A type process of coming in and taking some questions and looking at this. So for today's session, we'll jump into the setup options and the setup configurations. When I talk about that premium, that primary and backup, this is an option in here where you can do a live stream setup. And this is when I highlight this is what we call a server URL. And there's a stream key, right? This is the stream key, is what you're going to put into your encoder, right? And that's what is going to be identified and associated with this event. People have asked, and if you look at this, the server URL is RTMPS, and what RTMPS is really, RTMP has been around for some time. That was the original of taking video and audio and doing this online. RTMPS is really now RTMP with a secure connection, ensuring that a secure path from a security level. And the stream key is the unique identifier associated with this particular event. And what Facebook offers you is to use a persistent stream key, where you can use that common key to be associated with the event, as well as, so if you didn't want to change that key every time, you could use that. There's a persistent key option, as well as you can also set up a backup stream that I mentioned. We'll get that to another session, but this is an area where you would have a backup stream and you were doing things there. And then in settings, you're going to have, if in the live video, if the event stream stops, you want to turn this off. And the reason why is that if you leave that on, and let's say you have a network issue or something out, you don't want the stream to stop. Because once Facebook detects this stream there's something going on, they're not seeing any video, the assumption is, my understanding is that the video will then, if it sees no video going on, then it'll stop the entire stream, and you don't want to get into that mode. So to avoid that kind of potential pitfall and that being kind of a train wreck, I've generally turned that off. You can leave embed live video turned on. This is an embed code. Embed code refers to, you can take a piece of code and you can insert this into a web page that would pull using the Facebook stream or player, and then that would give you an embed code. And if I get there, you'll see right here, there's an option, and there actually is a 1080 option there. So you can embed that code on a web page. You can bypass this spherical video. Nobody's really doing 360 live streams today. There is a lot of VR type AR, we call augmented reality type videos being produced and content, and generally those have been in a area where you are doing that in I would call captured post-production edit and then posting the video. Could you do a 360 live stream video? Yes. Very complicated, much deeper level discussion in terms of the technology and things that are integrated there. From a viewing perspective, you can give people the option to rewind and what we call scrub back into during the live event or simulate a live event into the video in the live stream, and be able to go back from the beginning or somewhere in between. If you do leave this on, be aware of the fact that if you, let's say they did that and they're 20 minutes behind, you run the potential risk where once you come to the end of the live event and you stop that, they'll be bumped out. I've generally turned this off. If they jump into the live stream, then that's where they're at. But if you do want to provide that option, you can. If they do jump in the live stream where they're at, in terms of where you're at currently in the live event, then that's where they can go to an archive of the event and watch that in its entirety. And that's usually what I recommend from a best practice perspective. There's generated captions and allowing viewers to message you, and you can control comments, right? You can set restrictions and discussions. This gets more into where you have a moderator and you want to make sure how you want to handle certain areas of discussion. Do you want to slow it down so you can respond appropriately? Do you want to have certain protection mechanisms in place? I wouldn't allow the viewers to message you. It's, again, another facet of the process that you need to manage. And so when you're doing a live, you're really focused on delivering the live stream. You do want to respond to the comments or have a moderator or host, and you can do that now with Facebook. And so that's an area here to what it's referring to. You can enable viewers now to send stars during this video. It's just like, it's just seeing the little love option, right? And you can turn that on and do that as well to allow them if you want them to do that. As far as badges and hosts, there is a badge you can assign to the host, and that just gives you the option to have a host badge, if you will, in regards to them being identified as a moderator of the conversation. This is good for churches and nonprofits, or if you're doing some kind of another type of chat activity and you do have somebody handling the comment management chat function, that's very helpful. So that's another option to look at that you can think about in terms of that workflow that I mentioned. To finish up, I talked about quick access to your videos. You can show a live tab on your page. So when people go to your page, they can click to that. And if there's a live event going, you can turn that on. There's a live event URL video that will be there. So if I turn this on, you'll see that once the video is created, there'll be some kind of a generated activity and on that front. So when you do that, what's really left? Well, at the end of the day, I talked about that preview in the premium, right? So as many of you may have experienced, when you do that test broadcast, but even before you go live, let's say you're doing that 20 minutes out type of process, this, in terms of preparing for your live event, this is an area that where you would take and jump into this and say, okay, well, once you start the stream, either from your software encoder or say a hardware-based encoder, live streaming encoder type system, this is where I can preview the feed, right? And I can double check my video, what resolution is it coming at, what's the audio look like, are there, and actions is referring to the event log. So when you first join and start the stream, Facebook will have this area where it sees the incoming video and it sees that signal coming in, and then it kind of does what we call this demuxing process behind the scenes. And what that really means is taking the content you're streaming to them and then publishing, and then next thing you know, you see the preview of your screen or audio, and that allows you to go in and test. I certainly encourage you to take a look at that, because that's an area of, again, that test and validation before you go live to make sure everything's functioning. That 20-minute I mentioned parameter is helpful just from the perspective that if something was wrong, you need to reboot a system, you need to check a camera, audio, whatever it may be, right? That's your window of opportunity to go and test and validate. So down below, obviously, if I scroll down, you'll see that there's a little window here, and that's just where that window specifically, again, giving you a preview of that. Hey, thanks again for watching the Facebook and going through this with me. I hope it was helpful as we kind of wrap this up right now. If these videos are going to be helpful and supportive of what you want to do, let me know how we can do it better. I think we're in an area of education. And so part of this, while this channel may be somewhat technology focused and more technical, there are some areas that we want to think about when it comes to the basic avenue of helping you develop better abilities and skills and things and competencies when it comes to using something like Facebook and others out there in the community, and just overall collaborating, right? That's the goal of this channel, is talking about connecting, streaming, and delivering, right? So thank you. Comments, ring that bell, subscribe. Take care, stay safe, stay well.